Hey everyone, my name is Mike Ragsdale. I'm here hosting a special event today on behalf of the Seaside Institute. I have a very special guest with us, and we're here to discuss the work revolution that's happening, the transition from traditional corporate world to more of a remote work environment. And we want to talk to an expert on whether that change is something that could benefit our county, Walton County, Florida, right here along scenic Highway 38, which is home, of course, to Seaside, Florida, a new urbanist village, and numerous other new urbanist communities. So first of all, Richard, Florida, the aptly named Richard, Florida, welcome to the show.
Thanks, man. It's great to be back with you.
We'd also like to thank Sowell House for hosting us, and also the Seaside Arts and Entertainment Group for funding this particular episode. Richard, so tell me, when is the last time you were down here in our community?
I'd say it was about 10 or 15 years ago after I wrote a book called Rise of the Creative Class. And, I had heard a lot about Seaside before that, from folks in the Urbanist and New Urbanist community. So it was fantastic for me to get to see it. And, I'd love to come back. We head to Miami Beach in the wintertime or in the fall time. So we're not too far away. And we spend about 6 months of the year there. So I'd love to head over and see you in person.
We would love that. Richard is one of the world's leading urbanists. He's a writer and journalist. He's penned numerous books, including Who's Your City, which is particularly pertinent to this episode. And he's also the co-founder of City Lab, which is the world's leading publication for cities and urbanism. So you guys really study urbanism and how it relates to human activity. But we're seeing, not just because of the pandemic, but because of the technology and other factors, we're seeing what everyone believes is a major shift in how we all work and live. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I'd say I'd say that what pandemics do is accelerate shifts that are already going underway. And I think this pandemic is a big accelerator. And of all the shifts, the many shifts, some of which have been inappropriately or inaccurately talked about, the shift to remote work is the biggest. And, that was already bubbling up before the pandemic. But I think the pandemic has created this enormous experiment, if you will, in remote work. And I think that's going to stick around, and that's going to change. That's going to have the biggest impact on how we work and live.
So for anyone who doesn't know, including a lot of locals, Walton County is one of the fastest growing counties in the nation. In fact, I think we rank 6th. We're the fastest growing county in the state of Florida. Our schools are seeing a huge influx of students, and our population has almost doubled since the last census. Now, in fairness, we're a small town. Typically, this has been a beach destination for a lot of families throughout the Southeast, but all of a sudden that's exploding, and we're going from a small town of, our county maybe had 40,000 residents last census. Now we're up to about 75,000, and even fewer that live in the southern part of the county here. But we see a huge influx of tourists every year. So in millions, I think 4 million tourists a year. So now we're seeing a lot of those, especially during the pandemic. We saw a lot of people come here and just say, you know what, this is where I want to be, because suddenly they were freed from having to be anchored to a cubicle or to a commute. So we're seeing people not just from Alabama, Georgia, Nashville, Louisiana. Further afield, we're seeing Houston, we're seeing Dallas, we're seeing Austin, and now we're really seeing people from California and New York come here. So it's also, it's a wonderful thing, but it's a double-edged sword, because we want to protect, of course, the culture here, and we want to make sure that our culture survives this transition. So we wanted to talk to you a little bit today about your background, about some of the work you've done, and about how Walton County in particular might be able to set itself up for what you seem to be purporting is potentially a new economy, a new a way to look at things rather than looking at the world through the corporate lens, through the lens of talent and the individual. So you came here many years ago to promote your book, The Rise of the Creative Class, which went on to be a huge bestseller. But there were a couple of things recently. You did an article in the Wall Street Journal called How Remote Work is Reshaping America's Urban Geography. And then we also watched a Strong Towns podcast with you in which you really talk about something called Zoom Towns, which I want to get into in a moment. But in Who's Your City, I first want to talk about the geography of happiness. What is the relationship between a person's home location and their ability to live a happy and fulfilled life, in your opinion?
Well, first, what's happening in Walton County doesn't come as a surprise. I mean, obviously, you've been building up a great community filled with great places to live and great places to work and great places to go to the beach. And you mentioned that's appealing to tourists. So some of the things that appeal to tourists also appeal to residents. I think the thing that's been going on with Florida is especially interesting. We took our place in Miami Beach about a dozen years ago when we moved from Washington, D.C. to Toronto, because Toronto, which is in the back of you, is cold. And we've seen Florida really change a lot. The state of Florida, the economy's grown. The arts and cultural scene has grown. It's no longer just a fun in the sun destination, or in some parts, party all night destination. And I think it offers, at least Walton County offers, this quality of life with more affordable housing prices, although housing prices are going up. And I think the other thing is that what COVID did is it made people tilted their biases or preferences from necessity to wanting to have more space and to wanting to be outdoors more. So in that sense, warm temperatures really, really help. And the other thing, and I don't want to get all political, and someone who's a university professor and comes from the academic left, I think this is a double-edged sword, but the absence of restrictions, particularly the ability to keep kids in school during the winter, actually helped. And I know that sounds very odd, but I think there's now evidence, and I'm writing on this, that the absence of restrictions, I was very careful. We put our kids in school in Florida in a pod school. I took great care. We tested like crazy, but I think we were able to give our kids who are 4 and 5, or were 4 and 5 at the time, a normal life. And I think that's appealing to people. So I think there's a range of factors that have tilted the scales towards Florida, which brings me back to your question about my book, Who's Your City? I had been writing about cities and urban affairs for a long time. And, in that book, I tell a very simple story. Growing up in Newark, New Jersey, the son of working class people, my dad worked in a factory. My dad always told me, Rich, study hard, get a good education, go to college, get an advanced degree. That will position you for success in the American dream. My mother said, yeah, your father's an interesting guy, but think about it. He only had a 7th grade education. He worked in a factory. We didn't have a lot of money, but I love your father dearly. And we had 2 boys, myself and my brother, Robert. And so make sure you pick a partner. That's even more important than, finding this great career. Find a partner who you love and build a family. And that was great advice. But what my parents never told me is that those 2 things depend on a third choice, or a third element of life, which is where you live. Where you live has a big effect on the kind of university you might go to, or the kind of schools you might go to. It has a big effect on the kind of jobs that are available to you. It has a big effect in who you can date and go out to meet, and who your friends are, and who you can find as a life partner. So, yeah, I said that we need to be much more strategic about that, and we need to elevate that to the kind of conversations we have about partners and dating. There's all sorts of dating advice, good and bad. There's all sorts of career advice, but no one talks about picking a place advice. And one of the things about the pandemic, maybe a slight silver lining in this otherwise kind of tragic set of affairs that we're finally emerging from, is that it's made people ask these questions. Maybe I wrote that book a decade too early. Now, for the first time in my life, I see people all over America and all over the world asking really deep questions about where they want to live, how they want to live, how they want to work. So I think that finally the conversation I wanted to stimulate or jumpstart in that book has become a reality.
So we live in this age of globalization, and some people say as long as you got wireless and a cell phone, you're good. If your work is conducive to being remote. Is that true? I mean, is place, they might argue that place is irrelevant as long as you've got connectivity. Is that true, or are you finding in your research that that's short of the real answer?
I think we have to take this in context that this isn't the first time that this point has been made. It was made initially with the invention of the telephone, then with the invention of automobiles, and then with the invention of airplanes, and certainly with the rise of the internet. Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist, wrote a whole book about this called "The World Is Flat," saying that the constraints of the Economist 10 or 20 years ago ran headlines: "We have overcome geography, distance is dead, and the world is flat." It's sort of utter nonsense. The world isn't flat at all. In fact, what we've seen over the past couple of decades is economic activity has clustered and concentrated much more in bigger metropolitan areas, the New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., Acela Corridor, the West Coast around San Francisco and L.A. You can go on about this. In that same book, I talked about the rise not only of cities and metropolitan areas, but these great mega regional clusters like that New York, Acela Corridor, New York, Boston, Washington, Acela Corridor, areas around London, Beijing and Shanghai, Bombay and Mangalore, Brazil to Rio. I could go Rio to Sao Paulo. I could go on. And really, I think one of the striking things is that as we've been developed these technologies, which would enable us to spread out, we've become more clustered and concentrated. And I think we should think of remote work as a different kind of technology. It's not going to enable people to spread out everywhere. It essentially, it's like what the car did by enabling the rise of suburbia or street railways before that. That remote work is a new technology which stretches the boundaries of existing places. Most of the relocations that have been made during the pandemic, 75% of them have been in the same county, 85% of them has been in the same metro. The places that have grown in 2020 and 2021 look a lot like the places that have grown from 2015 to 2019. The most rapid growing places in America have been the ex-urban and rural fringe, large superstar cities, places like the Hudson Valley outside of New York. Now, what remote work also does, and you mentioned this, is enable the rise of a very small number of Zoom towns, places that have invested a lot in amenities, that might have a good university or college, that may be near a ski slope or near beautiful beachfronts, places like Bozeman, Montana, or Jackson Hole, Wyoming, or Aspen, Colorado. I could go on. But there's not a huge number of these. Maybe there's a couple of dozen of them. And even with regard to your own location, you're not out in the wilderness by any means. You're connected by great airports. You have airports, reasonably good airports nearby. This is really important, the ability to get to and from major hubs like New York or the West Coast or Boston or Washington, D.C. You are part of a mega regional formation, or at the fringes of a mega regional formation that runs from Miami, all the way to Tampa and Orlando. You mentioned the attractiveness of people from Dallas and Houston. You're then on the fringes of another mega regional formation we call the Texas Triangle, which runs from Dallas to Houston to Austin and San Antonio. So you're in a big economic center. I mean, if you take these two economic centers that, your county is kind of at the fringe at, they're probably the size of a top 10 global economy. They may be even as large as a place like the United Kingdom. I could look up the statistics. So Walton County is not out in the middle of nowhere. It is equivalent to, in many ways, what the Hudson Valley offers to New Yorkers. Walton County offers. And you're right. What's happened now is that people from California and New York look at the advantages, the trade-offs, but the advantages of moving to a place in Florida, and they say, well, I can lower my taxes. I have less restrictions. I can send my kids to school. And then finally, you'd mentioned tourism, and I think you said there were 4 million tourists. I think the other thing that Walton County should keep its eye on, I finally saw an essay on this week, and I've been thinking about it since I wrote Who's Your City, so over a decade. They talked about the extraordinary purchases of second and third homes during the pandemic. We're going to see an increasing number of people who are multi-locational households. And there was another article in the past 2 weeks talking about the millennial snowbird, which, you'd always thought of snowbirds as these old people. Kids have gone off to college or university, left the nest, they're empty nesters. Well, this new category of snowbirds people who might live up north but don't want to endure the winter is growing, and it's becoming younger. And all I can say is, I probably know, and I'm not kidding you, a dozen people from Toronto who bought condominiums or houses in Florida in the past 2 years. And then you add in all the people from New York and California that are doing the same thing. In a way, it's a hedge against the pandemic. In a way, it's saying, Florida offers me warmer winters, more outside time, the ability to keep my kids in school during the pandemic. But in a way, once they root there, it becomes a real locational option, and you see people. So I think it's both permanent residents. There's three categories. It used to be permanent residents and tourists. Now there's permanent residents, significant part-time residents, and tourists. And I think that Walton County has benefited a lot from that second category, these kind of people who are there for a good chunk of the year.
Yeah, and I want to talk in a second about Zoom towns. I'm a Tim Ferriss 4-hour work week. I built my whole business off that model. So, our business has been virtual, for the last 15, 20 years. And, the pandemic kind of super accelerated these things that were inevitable. Distance learning, a lot of the things that were forced upon us. I think it probably just super accelerated them by 5 or 10 years. But what we've seen here is an explosion, exactly what you're talking about. People coming to the area saying, the pandemic really not only freed the genie from the bottle, but it made them start to value their time, and to wonder whether spending 2.5 hours in a commute was the best use of their time. And I think also companies began to question, do I need high-rise office space? Do I need all of the liability and insurance and HR that goes along with, having everybody drive to a central location? So I think there are communities like ours that have the potential to benefit from this shift. And so I want to talk, what is, for those who don't know, how do you define a Zoom town?
Well, it's not my construction. I forget who invented the moniker. It's pretty clever. But I think a Zoom town is a place, I did this project, a decade and a half ago in Noosa, Australia, which is a place quite similar to Walton County. It's really spectacularly beautiful, one of those beautiful places I've ever been. And they were talking then about attracting the barefoot executive, right? The person like you who doesn't want to punch a clock, doesn't want to commute, doesn't want to wear a suit and a tie, likes to go to the beach, likes to surf, enjoy the water. And they saw that then. That's what a Zoom town is. It's a place that's a lifestyle destination where people who are, and I want to say this, far enough along in their career, when they have the developed network to enable themselves to work remotely, can go and live and raise their family. On that same trip, I went to New Zealand and I met Peter Jackson. And Peter Jackson has created a Zoom town in Wellington, New Zealand. And, he's the director, producer of The Lord of the Rings. I think he's done this new Beatles documentary. He's an amazing guy. And
I'm assuming it's a town full of hobbits and dwarves and
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And he said, I couldn't have done this when I was a young person. I had to live in LA. Yeah. I had to develop a network. I had to develop trust. I had to have hit movies. But now I can live wherever I want. And I think this is really important when we think about a Zoom town. And I would say it's a couple of dozen, maybe up to 100. It's not infinite. A Zoom town, if I had to define it, would be a place that is high amenity. That could be a mountain. That could be a wonderful lakefront. Traverse City, Michigan would be a good example of this. Could be oceanfront. Would be a place that might have a university or college, could be small. The Pensacola phenomenon in Pensacola with that university that's there. The small colleges in parts of Maine and New England and these lovely places that happen to be cold. Traverse City that I mentioned has a great airport. You can get direct flights to Boston, New York, Washington, Chicago, Dallas, so forth. Ski slopes, part of Colorado or Montana, Wyoming, the Great Ranges. But it has to offer a kind of access and a bundle of amenities that are unique and exciting, and oftentimes has upped its artistic and cultural offerings, has spent the past couple of decades making sure that the food scene, and that's one of the things that's very interesting. 20 years ago, when I wrote Rise of the Creative Class, the amenities you could get, the cultural amenities, artistic amenities, music performances, access to food, restaurants, coffee shops, was just a different world in New York or San Francisco or LA or Boston and Washington than the rest of the world, the rest of the United States. Now, because those places have gotten so darn expensive, you actually can find better local coffee shops. I'm looking at the space you're in, better co-working or incubation spaces, better cool restaurants because chefs want to go where they can afford. Even Danny Meyer said in New York, he said, I don't know if I could make it in New York today. It's so expensive. I think that's the case with these Zoom towns, that they had already been developing this. And then once the pandemic struck, they had become extremely attractive places to live and work. But they're not everywhere. Not every place can be a Zoom town. You really need to have airport access, probably access to educational institutions. You need great natural amenities or built up amenities, and then you're a Zoom town.
So it's interesting because, we have, to your point, an abundance of talent here. And in a minute, I want to talk about the shift from corporate perspective to the individual and to the talent perspective that you highlight in your books. But that's what we see here is, we have chefs that worked, at the finest restaurants in New York or Paris or wherever, but they chose a pay cut because of the lifestyle that they could enjoy here. They want to be able to put a closed sign when the surf is up in their window, and they want to be able to enjoy their life. So it's not, I would tell you that where we live, prices have gone up to the point where sometimes I have people, my daughter lives in New York City, and, people come here and like, dang, it's expensive here.
Can I pick up on that for a second? Because I think it's something I don't want to lose, and we'll come back to your main point. I think that you all in Walton County and other Zoom towns have to realize that there's a huge demographic divide in talent attraction. That your daughter, how old is your daughter?
I have 4 children. She's probably 28.
People like your daughter are going to all move to New York City. And I say that specifically. New York City as a talent attraction machine for the young and ambitious, people post-college or post-MBA or post-law degree, the great preponderance of them are going to one city, New York. Some will go to Chicago. Some, if they want to be in Hollywood, will go to LA. A few will go. New York is the second largest tech hub in the world. It's the largest financial and probably largest media center. It has all of these young, ambitious people who are going from great universities all over the United States and the world. London, which used to be attractive, has to deal with Brexit. Hong Kong is dealing with China. So you're going to have this demographic divide in America. And I just want to make, before we go on, where young people like your daughter are going to go to New York City and a few other places like New York City. And then at some point, you'll know more. Your kids are older than mine. They decide, I'm going to have a family. I talk about this in Who Use Your City. 3 big moves right after college. And those moves are increasingly to the biggest city, right? Biggest city, most opportunity. Not when you get married, when you have kids. The family formation moves are the moves to, and they used to be to the next door suburb, right? They used to be to Westchester County or a lovely part of New Jersey or somewhere in Connecticut. Now young people are saying, screw that. I can go to Walton County. I could go to the East Coast of Florida. I could go to Nashville. I could go to Bozeman, go wherever the hell I want because I've been established. And then the third move, of course, is when you're an empty nester and your kids move away. But I just want to say that what Walton County is probably competing for is not people like your daughter's age. You're competing for people at the family formation stage or at the empty nester stage. And you just have to be really thoughtful about that. And then there's one other thing I wanted to mention. I forgot to, and we can move on. And this is for Walton County and other Zoom towns. If you really wanted to grow, schools would be different. What happens is that people with families, schools are the number one factor. And then they begin to make this very complicated calculation. I like the beach better. I like the sun better. I like the outdoor sports better. But do I want to commit to Florida 9 months or 10 months a year? I like it 6 months of the year. And that, for some people, and I would say a minority, not a majority, say, okay, I'm going to take the leap. I'm going to leave my friendship network and my family, and I'm going to move to Florida. Most of them say, nope, I'm going to keep my place in Florida. And I'm going to go during breaks and during the winter, and I'm going to be a snowbird. You had mentioned that the site you're in was a remote school. I've been thinking about this for a long time. Schools in the North, I know it sounds ridiculous, need to figure out something really simple, that they could have not just a summer break, but they could give you the option of doing a summer break or a winter break. So you could put your kids through school that would go all summer, and the break would go December, January, February, March, or February, January, February, March, part of April. Or schools in Florida could figure out a way to arrange their calendar so that they enable snowbirds to base there more of the year. So instead of maybe having to go to school in Florida, which is ridiculous, on August 15th, you could come to Florida on October 15th. And maybe some of that is done remotely. But if school would start on October 15th or November 1st in Florida, the ability to attract more people permanently would be off the chart. So I think the big thing that it's going to be a conversation that we're going to see in the next 10 to 20 years is going to be, how do we make schooling more flexible for people who want to live in multiple locations? Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's all good. So specifically Walton County, one of the things I find really interesting about the work that you're a proponent of is that it's a shift in thinking from company to talent. And so in Walton County, for example, we're a small town. I mean, this place, for all intents and purposes, did not exist 30 years ago. I mean, it was nothing but dunes and scrub that you could not give away. And Seaside comes along. The concept of new urbanism develops, et cetera. And some locals know that story, but I won't go into it here. But we have two basic industries. We have real estate and we have tourism, hospitality. So that is, for the most part, the biggest drivers of economic force that we have here. However, obviously, we want to be more stable. We want another leg or two on that stool. And so I think they have made valiant efforts to try and recruit businesses here, right? Like, hey, we're going to bring solar here. We're going to bring recycling here. We're going to bring all of these. But we haven't had that much success with that, because obviously you're competing with a lot of other markets who are trying to bring the Amazons and the Googles or whoever. What you're proposing is that instead of bringing companies, we should be focused on bringing talent, because economic development follows talent. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, when I wrote about this, I was living in Pittsburgh, watching all our talented people, the people who invented the internet. I taught at Carnegie Mellon. They were just leaving. And even though we had a university that on a pound for pound basis was outperforming MIT or Stanford, and not only performing this in terms of research, but building up startup companies, the people who were populating those startup companies were all moving to San Francisco or Boston or Austin, Texas. And so it became clear to me that firms were important, but talent was, and at that point I said it was one of two, companies, and people said I was crazy. I had the chicken and egg problem. Talent always moves to high paying jobs. They move to where the best, and that wasn't the case. My kids were turning down jobs in Pittsburgh, kids I was teaching, and they were moving to much more higher price metros like San Francisco or Boston, because they thought they were just more vibrant, exciting places with better stuff to work on, more companies to go to and move around in jobs, and more exciting people to meet. So fast forward 20 years, and I think it's now widely, I just addressed the major group of economic developers, the International Economic Development Council in Nashville, their annual meeting. That's all people talk about is talent. Mm-hmm. When Amazon went out for its search for its second headquarters, it's the first thing it said: we need a talent pool. We need an exciting city that's walkable and will attract talent with great universities. So look, and I think the COVID-19 pandemic has made it clear to everyone that talent is the main factor of production. Now, if you look at corporate location and why I think Walton County would be mistaken to try to pin its hopes on corporate location, if you look where Google and Facebook and Amazon and these big companies are expanding, it's New York City. And, they put an installation in Boulder, and they put an installation in Ann Arbor, and they put, something small in Nashville. But they realized that what they have to locate for is young talent fresh out of engineering and business schools. That people crammed and jammed like your daughter in small apartments in big cities that need an office, that need to be acculturated. So the big business projects are increasingly going to go to bigger cities where young people are. Now, there'll be other projects that go to smaller places, and you should think about your economic future. But here's what I'd say with regard to Walton County and Seaside. I think Seaside was the right project for its time. It was an exciting project with a new way of developing, devoted to new urbanist principles, attracting a group of people like you and me, right, who were already established, could live where we wanted access to the water and the sun and better weather and not snow and ice. I think that there's another evolution of Seaside, which Seaside is already, but I think it's something that is a tweak, if you will, of the Seaside New Urbanist model. And I'd call that something like a remote work community. That's what I'd call it. A remote work community, not just a new urbanist community, but geared to remote work. And here's where I think the opportunity is to develop a community which is an ecosystem for remote work, not just a wonderful, and I know you're doing it because we're talking together and you're in the place, but a place which understands that remote work is not work from home. We know that a lot of remote work is conducted outside the home, in a coffee shop, in a restaurant, in a library, in a cafe, in a hotel lobby, in another person's house, in a friend's conference room. So what if we were to build up places that were essentially remote work communities, which not only had houses that were supportive of remote work and remote work learning, but had a community built up as a remote work ecosystem? And I think that's what the next evolution of our development projects are. I think those can go in beautiful high amenity communities like Walton County. I think those could go in second and third tier city like Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Bentonville, Arkansas. They could go in places like Bozeman, Montana. They can go into rural fringe communities outside of New York that I've mentioned, not just the Hudson Valley, but places like Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So I think, and those can not only be de novo developments like Seaside, you could repurpose an old mid-century office park, an IBM office park or an AT&T Bell Labs office park that was built by some great mid-century architect that would be like the incubator and accelerator and remote work spaces and remote learning spaces, and surround them with beautiful residential development. You could take a historic mall, an architecturally significant mall, and do the same thing. So look, I think there is this next iteration of community building, which is much less, which is not so tied just to great living, but is really tied to high performance remote work. And I think people haven't really latched onto it, but I think that's the next great development opportunity.
So let's assume our county, for whatever reason, proximity to large cities or other things that might prevent us from landing, a Google or whatever. Instead, let's say we focus on talent. A lot of these Zoom towns, a lot of these communities are offering very specific incentives. They're offering not only financial offers, but they're offering, free use of co-working spaces. They're offering martial arts classes. Some of them are offering electric bike. If you move here, we'll give you $10,000 and a bike to hit the trails. They're even offering, in some cases, babysitting services. So is that something that our county, rather than looking at it and saying, hey, corporation, we're going to offer you tax incentives, we're going to offer you land. Instead, we should be saying, hey, talent who works remotely, we're going to offer these sorts of incentives. Is that the type of thing that our community should be thinking about?
So I certainly think you should focus on talent attraction and retention as opposed to business attraction and recruitment and retention. I know most of these programs. I'm very close. I'm a consultant to the George Kaiser Family Foundation, which built Tulsa Remote, the best example, the first mover project, the signature example, the one that offers a $10,000 stipend. We'll come back to that. And also, I am a consultant to the Walton Family Foundation and help them to think through. I didn't design, but help them to think through their own remote work initiative in Northwest Arkansas. They give a bike because they've invested in a world-class set of road cycling and off-road cycling, and they're headquartered because they care about the outdoor economy. They have a company there called Allied Bicycles, which make spectacularly beautiful bikes. I mean, they're off-the-chart beautiful bikes made in America, and they give one of those bikes to their recruits. I'm not a big fan of incentives. And so I don't think you necessarily have to spend money on incentives. That said, look, $10,000 for a remote worker, places offered $3, $4, $5 billion for Amazon HQ2. $10,000, how many workers is that? My math's not good. Mm-hmm. If you get up to $1 billion, how many workers does $1 billion in remote work incentives get you? Like 100,000? Mm. 100,000? I mean, it's like, yeah. And I think what I've always said to the remote work programs is don't call it an incentive. That just sounds ugly and it gets people locally upset. call it support for moving an office setup. Moving your belongings from San Francisco or New York to Tulsa, Oklahoma, Walton County, Seaside, Florida, is expensive. And then you have to set up your house and you have to put in Zoom shit and camera like I have and lighting. And that adds up to $10,000. So call it a relocation subsidy, a relocation grant. That said, I think what makes the Tulsa program, Tulsa now has 1,300 remote workers who moved there from New York, San Francisco, Austin, like all the hotspots. What makes that program go isn't the incentive per se. It was an important signal back in the day. It's the fact that the Tulsa program really offers people a better quality of life. And it actually helps them form both a peer community of other remote workers. And I think there are 20 or 30 people who work at Tulsa Remote now. So it's not just hand, money, and come. There is a lot of effort that goes to connecting people to the community, to finding the right neighborhood to live, to building, becoming part of the civic fabric of Tulsa. And the other thing I think that what they found is what's so attractive about Tulsa, probably also the case in Walton County, is that a lot of people moving were not just doing it for lower taxes or lower cost of living. A lot of people wanted to get out of, let's call it their blue bubble. And a lot of these people are progressive. They tend to go on the left. They tend to vote for Democrats. But they got tired of the bubble of their community and wanted to live in a community that has a more mixed Republican, Democrat, red and blue. And I know that sounds strange, but I'm that person. I like to be around people who are different than me. I like to be around people who challenge me, who I might not agree with, but we can have a civil conversation. And they found that with their remote workers. Their remote workers, the reason they wanted to move from San Francisco or New York or Boston to Tulsa was to be part of a more realistically American community. Mm-hmm. So I think building up that civic fabric, getting people bonded to the community. And then I think with regard to Walton County, I really think you need to think about part-time talent. I've said this all throughout the state of Florida in speaking engagement after speaking engagement, that Florida attracts a lot of people on a part-time basis who are extraordinarily important contributors. Like when I was a visiting professor at MIT right before the pandemic, and I like people who are my mentors. So I went to see a whole bunch of professors who are now in their 70s and 80s. For some reason, many of these professors had landed in and around Sarasota, Florida. They had no connection to Sarasota, Florida. They spent the winter there. Their intellectual connection was back at MIT or Harvard. But hold on. I mean, if you have a bunch of people from Harvard and MIT sitting in and around Sarasota, Florida, make use of them. Build an intellectual incubator. I could say the same thing with regard to Miami Beach. Instead of focusing on all-night partying and up till 5 a.m. in clubs, which nobody does anymore. Even in the big cities, the clubs are being replaced by juice bars and group fitness activities and wellness. Focus on all the interesting people who are here from Harvard or MIT or Columbia or from New York or San Francisco and build something around them, build some, signature institutes, build some think tanks, do something that builds up the intellectual climate. And I think that's the kind of thing, thinking about these kind of part-timers. And the reason they're part-time is not because they wouldn't live there full-time. It's because they don't find the intellectual firmament that they find in colder northern cities. And that's why they go back there. Think about this and think about how you can bolster that and make it a place that has that kind of appeal. And it's doable and it's not very expensive. So that's the kind of things you should be thinking about.
So let's say that we say, okay, we're not going to focus on incentives, but perhaps we should. We already have a lot of things going our way. The obvious natural beauty and the obvious, very appealing, walkable village life that we enjoy here. And we also, Florida has no state income tax. So in some ways, we've already kind of got the platform. Should we, rather than be thinking about incentives, should we instead be focused on amenities, whether it's investing in workspace, things that would benefit the whole community, yes, not just someone brought it in, so like shared workspace, for example?
All of those things. So I think thinking about what a remote work ecosystem is and a remote learning ecosystem is and how you have the best in the world. And I think not just remote work, remote learning. How do you set up flexible schools? I really think this is your biggest, the remote work is part of it, but how do you set up flexible schooling for people who want to live in multiple locations? And, let's look at Bentonville, Arkansas, where I mentioned. they actually created a school called the Thaden Academy, which is a world-class private school. They've invested in this network of bike and hike and bike and riding trails. They've invested in, world-class museums. They're working with the University of Arkansas to create an urban innovation center, which could be a think tank. The other thing I was thinking, I'm looking at you under your little name on Zoom. It says Seaside Institute. Think about what the Aspen Institute has done for Aspen, Colorado. And Aspen is a wonderful place to ski, but it's really the Aspen Institute that makes it a kind of intellectually exciting place that people go to in the summer, those kinds of things. And I think in Florida, we have discounted intellect. If I had one complaint about Florida, and I love the place, it is focused on arts and cultural and natural amenities and better access to ocean, but it is not really focused on building up its intellectual. And an example I would use here is the New World Symphony in Miami Beach. The New World Symphony in Miami Beach was the brainchild of Michael Tilson Thomas. And his idea was that he could train these new 20th and 21st century classical musicians in Miami Beach, but he didn't build up a school with a whole bunch of local instructors. What he said is, lots of people like to go to Miami Beach in the winter. So I'll get people from the Cleveland Symphony and the New York Philharmonic and the Toronto Symphony and whatever, all the great symphonies and new classical music people in the world to come here and do winter residencies. They might come from a week, they might come for a month, they might come for the season. And they'll train these kids who are here on 2-year fellowships. Well, that's a model that's scalable and usable in other domains. And I really think it's building up the intellectual the amenities are critical. The remote work ecosystem is critical. And then building up the intellectual backbone of our great high amenity places. So people think it's not just a place to play golf or to go surfing or to get on my boat. It's a place where I can engage my full intellectual self. The other thing I think that Florida has going for it, and maybe a thing to build around, is that fitness and wellness, especially for the baby boomers, if you will, have become really high priorities. And Florida is the kind of place that could build up an economy, more of an economy around fitness and wellness. So that's another part.
But this isn't just, we're not doing this out of the goodness of our hearts and all that stuff. We're trying to build an economy here, that's more stable, something that's not so incredibly dependent on simply real estate and hospitality. But there is a real economic impact to a single individual moving to a new community. I mean, do you have any sort of research or impact, like numbers you could share that kind of tell us what that might mean?
Well, we're building the numbers now. And really it's remote work that has caused people to look, and in economic terms, they call this a multiplier. And people have looked at the multipliers of a given dollar of investment in a company. And then people have said, if you have and attract a high-tech company and a high-tech worker, you get 5 follow-on jobs in service and hospitality. At Tulsa Remote, and the data aren't out yet, so we should check back on this, they've commissioned a big study by a group called the Economic Innovation Group in Washington, D.C., to look at the economic impact of remote work. It's huge. So yeah, I think you should be thinking about talent multipliers and what happens. So, look at me. Now, little old me. I decide I want to get a place in Miami Beach. We get a place there a dozen years ago. I bet you we attracted, no shit, 15 other couples. Mm. No, easy, maybe 20. I mean, 2 of my wife's cousins bought places there. Mostly all of our friendship group in Toronto bought a place there. And I mean, they might have gone to another part of Florida. They might have wanted warm, but they bought there. So I think we know that moves are network-based. You see this with immigrant communities. You attract one person, you attract more. Yeah. And then the spillover effects of consumption and buying things and being engaged with your kids in schools, it's a huge impact. And we're only beginning now because of the boom in remote work to look at it, but it's a big number. I don't know the precise number. We'd have to check back with that study when it's done, but it's a big number.
So for someone who is not familiar with the remote working lifestyle, of course, most people are now because the pandemic, forced them to make those decisions. Do you see, where were the levels pre-pandemic and during pandemic, and where do you think they're going to settle post-pandemic?
So remote work has been increasing I'm kind of like you. I've always been a remote worker. I never like to go to the office. I've always lived close to where I work. I'm a university professor. I'd go in 1 or 2 times a week. I'd work mainly from home. I've always had a home office. So I like integrating work and life, and especially with kids. I have little kids now. I just like being around them, and I think it's important to be around them, even if they're doing their little school. They're right now in school in the backyard. And, I'm up here on a third floor Zoom studio talking to you. I think it was about 1 or 2% in 1980, and it got up to a few percent in about 2000. And then it got up to about almost 5% before the pandemic. So it was growing. And I remember sitting on a beach in Miami Beach, and this guy who was an executive at an East Coast company, he had his iPad. And this was probably 5 years ago. He said to me, this remote shit is possible now. Like, it wasn't possible 5 years ago, but now look at me. I got my iPad. I can be connected. Of course, the pandemic accelerated this. And the best estimates we have, which are rough and they're crude, but here's what they are. Nick Bloom at Stanford believes, based on he's very good economist, as good as it gets. I would say he's Nobel Prize caliber. He's really good. He believes that after the pandemic, 20% of all working days will be done remotely. And I would say his estimate is conservative. My friend Adam Ozemek, who I wrote the Wall Street Journal piece with, who's another leading authority on remote work, he thinks it's going to be about 20% full-time remote. And then another 10 or 15 or 20% who will work remote on some other basis. Now, those are big numbers, but you have to think about it this way for folks watching this. That's 20% of all workers. At least half the workforce can't work remotely. I would say it's almost 2/3 of the workforce: police, firemen, essential workers, logistics, delivery, healthcare workers. The heroes of our pandemic, by the nature, the people who work in manufacturing, they have to work together. Maybe a third of the work, a third or half of the workforce has the possibility of working remotely. Now, you take 20% of a third or 20% of 50%. Holy shit, that's a big number. Mm-hmm. You're talking about 40, 50, 60% of knowledge and professional workers who might be working remotely. The people who used to fill up those office towers. That's a big, big number when you think about the percentage of knowledge and professional workers who are going to work remotely. And I think there are two kinds of personalities in this world, and maybe you do too. I think there are people like us who like to work remotely, and then there are other people who like to be in the office. And, I don't know where that exactly breaks down. I don't like going to the office at all, but there are people who like it. And young people, of course, living in big cities, crammed and jammed into apartments, and they're not married and they don't have kids. Yeah, the office is exciting for them. But it is more of an incubator space. Like what we saw in New York is that people aren't going to the company. I mean, this may be behind the Google, Facebook thing you mentioned earlier. What we found is that people were going to places like WeWork, co-working spaces, or they were going to places like Neuhaus, more local versions of WeWork, because they were a blending of work and hospitality. They had coffee bars and places to get a snack and places to get lunch and, conference areas you could have a team meeting. And they had programming where they bring in guest speakers. People seem to like that a lot more than just the office for work. So I think it's a big deal.
Which seems to win in the end when people, there have to be a number of factors people consider. I mean, they have to be considering, as you mentioned, schools, they're considering taxes, they're considering climate. But when it comes down to cost of living versus lifestyle, schools. For parents, of course.
The thing that people don't get, if you ask me the one thing they don't get in America, and I don't know why. Yeah, people, if I really talk to people who have moved to Miami, and you're having a drink, it's late at night, and these are super high net worth people. So, the taxes are fine, Rich, but I wanted better schools for my kids. Mm-hmm. And I wanted my kids to go to school every day. I didn't want to deal with a shutdown and a lockdown. I don't think people realize how much school, we know this in the back of our heads. Like my parent, I was 7th grade education, moved from Newark, New Jersey to North Arlington, put us in Catholic schools, which my dad thought were better. He didn't go to school, but were Roman Catholic. He thought Catholic schools, just nuns and Christian brothers and priests, would be stricter. It was a good decision he made. And in the United States, urban schools are challenged because our schools are locally. They're not challenged in Toronto, which is behind me. Urban schools are provincially funded, so we have great urban schools. So Americans have long moved for school, right? That's where people move. They move to put their kids in a better school. And so I think with remote work, what people aren't thinking about enough is how do we build a school system to support it? And how do we build the kind of schools that people really like, that are a mix of in-class learning and remote, and give families the flexibility to be more mobile. I think the last geographic constraint on the remote worker is the school. If the schools would give, you'd get more people. I mean, you get better talent.
Do you see a convergence with distance learning ultimately factoring into that, to where just like some people will be able to do their job from Bangkok or Shanghai, will there be this convergence where education is the same way, that I can be lectured by a Harvard professor just as easily in Walton County as someone sitting in an auditorium, somewhere else? Do you see those converging and ultimately solving even perhaps part of that riddle?
So I think what we have to figure out is why do people like cities and communities? What do people get out of work? And what do people get out of school? And I think that's becoming clearer. We used to think we needed these boxes called a school. And in the US, we built these elementary schools are fine because they're based in neighborhoods. When you get to middle school and high school, someone tweeted this the other day, we built these giant institutions at the fringes of communities, which are just wrong. These giant mass production factories for education. Same thing we did with physical factories, same thing we did with office towers. What people need is connectivity and community. What people want to learn is to be around other people to learn from and to hang out with. What people want in work is not to sit in a cubicle with a laptop. It's to go. And when I was in New York City this summer, offices were shut down, but there were lineups at 4:30 in front of restaurants in Midtown filled with people dressed in business attire who wanted to get together with their colleagues. This connectivity function is really the key one. So I think for schools, it's not online Zoom learning. It's a flexible platform where kids can plug and play into various activities in various locations. And there's another, kids need to be around other kids. They like other kids, especially little kids like other kids. They meet them on the playground. They meet them in sports. They meet them in art class. But they need to be more plug and play. Let me give you an example. We actually got on the phone and called up Avenues, the World School. And they have a location in New York. They have a location here and there. They said they're going to build one eventually in Toronto, and they had bought a property in Miami. And we said, at Avenues, folks, could we put our kids in school half the year in New York? Eventually, if you build one in Toronto, if you do, and half the year in Miami? They said, no. So why the hell do you call yourself a world school? They said, well, we have campuses in different cities. I'm like, huh? But isn't the idea that you could spend half the year in Sao Paulo or London or New York and half the year in Miami or Walton County? No, I think the idea of a platform that's not just distance-based, but that has an array of activities, and maybe in a place like Seaside or Walton County, you probably remember all these international schools that cropped up in places like Beirut or in Germany or in France for American expatriates. Maybe you need a school like that where kids come and they plug in, and mom and dad need to be or want to be in another place for part of the year, but then the kids can plug into that school. In a way, that's what we're doing. We're doing it on our own with our kids. But I think there's a lot to gain in terms of getting more talent to Florida locations by making school much more accessible and flexible, and not just for Americans, from people from Latin America, from people from Europe, from people from Canada who would love to spend more time there, but find that the school issue keeps them out.
Well, I think this community especially is very creative and ahead of the curve in some ways. This very room that we're sitting in here, which is now the Sowell House, used to be called the Ohana Institute, and my children went to school there because I was living the Tim Ferriss 4-hour work week dream, and we took the kids out of school and went around the world for a year. And so they offered us the ability to be in Bosnia or to be in India or to be in Bali, and they could be what was not called Zoom at the time. They could be video conferencing with their teachers and still doing their lessons. And they were old enough, we weren't dealing with third graders, we were dealing with teenagers, and we would get a notice if they weren't handing in their homework, and we could get on to them. But, it really very much ahead of its time. And I just wondered whether you think it's going to continue to go in that direction.
I think scaling that and thinking about that in your community as a way that fits kids of all ages. Not simply because that's a talent constraint. If you ask me, now it's different in Walton County than in bigger cities in Florida. If you ask me the talent constraint in Florida, it's schools and universities. That's what it is. Mm-hmm. It's nothing else. It's schools and universities. So once you fix that, and you do that at the margin by making schools that are more remote or that are supplementing or part of another school system, Another example, this is a stupid example. Ransom Everglades Academy in Coconut Grove, which is the best private school in Florida and arguably one of the best private schools in America. If you read the history of Ransom Everglades Academy, it was started by one of the shishi New York or Massachusetts or New England schools as a one semester, in the Everglades. And after the war, it became a full-time school. Go back to that model. Do a partnership with Deerfield Academy or Hotchkiss. I'm making this up, Lawrenceville Academy. Do a school where you can spend half the year in the north and half the year in the south. And it's all doable if people think, and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That adds real advantage rather than going to try to attract a call center. Mm-hmm. So, and then I think these institutes, older professors, this is really interesting. When I talk to the folks who bought the places in Sarasota at MIT and Harvard, why did they buy them? Really simple reason. It's not that they liked the sun. They fell, they broke their hip. They slipped on the ice. It was a bad accident. At a certain age, ice and cold become a real risk to health. And so thinking about these intellectual centers as well, where these groups of people from top universities, in the world, come and spend time and hang out. I think that's something that Florida needs to think about as it moves from, it's no longer just full-time versus tourists. There's this continuum of people, some of whom are full-time, some of whom are tourists. And then one other thing I say you want to avoid. You don't have this problem, but here's the problem that I think Florida has. The United States today, during COVID, has developed a new category of tourism that I've given a name to. Blotto tourism. There are people, a growing group of people, young people, who go to destinations. Las Vegas would be the most obvious example. You see it partly in Nashville, you see it in Miami Beach, who go to destinations to get blotto and go to clubs all night and get wasted. Once that happens, your community is in deep trouble. Deep, 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 deep trouble. And avoiding what I would call blotto tourism, or what in Europe they call over-tourism. So, in Venice, in Barcelona, communities are really regulating tourism. Be really careful with short-term rentals and apartment shares that can get just out of hand. Not to say that they shouldn't exist, but they have to be regulated. Now it's not a problem in your neck of the woods yet, but man, when it sets in, this kind of blotto tourism, it becomes a stain, and companies begin to move. Companies go like, whoa, like we can't be here. And families go, whoa, we can't be here. So I think also avoiding some of the real downsides that go with tourism, and especially what we euphemistically call spring break tourism. That's a big thing that I'd say be careful of looking out.
Great advice. I want to thank our guest, Richard Florida. He is the author of The Rise of the Creative Class, The New Urban Crisis, and Who's Your City? He's a leading urbanist and a professor at the University of Toronto's School of Cities and at Rotman School of Management. He visited our lovely coastal community a decade or more ago. I want to invite you back, though, because it really is an extraordinary amount of things have happened here since your last visit. So we hope to see you in person, not just against the silhouette of your hometown there, or your city. But that said, we want to thank the Sowell House for hosting us today. I'm speaking on behalf of the Seaside Institute, and we'd like to thank the Seaside Arts and Entertainment Group for providing the funds to bring cultural personalities, authors, musicians, chefs, all sorts of people who come from all over the world physically and virtually, as is the case with Mr. Florida today. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for this explanation of Zoom towns. And we hope that you guys will follow the Seaside Institute so that you can stay apprised of all the amazing things that are happening in our community and all of the amazing things that we hope will be coming for Walton County in the future. So thank you, Richard.
Deal. I'll come visit. Thank you. It's been great being with you.
Bye, guys. Thank you.